Welcome to Biocomputation with Max. Today's Sunday, August 17th, 2025. The Trump-Putin meeting in Alaska is generating a lot of excitement and discussion. Now, this apparent rapprochement came from nowhere. Just a couple of days ago, it seems President Trump was sending nuclear submarines in response to a mean tweet from Dmitry Medvedev, well, a trolling tweet. Now we have the backdrop sign supporting peace when President Putin met President Trump. President Putin had the red carpet rolled out for him and discussion started. This is certainly a welcome sign considering the two of the world's nuclear powers are involved. Now, I think this meeting has been a great success, but I must confess an element of cynicism about the situation. Now, let me recap what is happening. Trump is choosing to cut a deal with Russians at the time of great weakness on the front lines. Now, why would Trump, who loves the leverage inherent in the art of the deal, come to talk in such a weak position? The alternative is worse. President Trump is getting out of the way of the oncoming train, which is the loss, military loss in the US to Russia in Ukraine. Now, Trump is sealing to pull up stakes, either to hand it off to Europeans or otherwise cut his losses, it seems. But the key is pivoting to Asia. The question is Trump willing to make a sincere peace with Russia, or is this just a temporary measure, what the Rand Institute calls strategic sequencing? In fact, we can say that strategic sequencing by Trump's second administration has been pretty good on the surface. Let's look at the list. He just cut an extremely favorable economic deal with the European Union. He had a meeting in Alaska with Putin and his entourage, starting negotiations with Russia, and he's getting his freedom for geopolitical pivot to China. Unfortunately, it's not all so rosy because of these secondary factors. Specifically, this hedging of the bets, that the US is still willing to sell weapons to the Europeans to provide to the Ukrainians to fight Russia. Also, a few days ago, President Trump signed a memorandum of understanding, not a peace deal, an MOU between Armenia and Azerbaijan, which seeks to give control of a strip of land here for 99 years. Now, this strip of land is bordering Iran and is unacceptable to them, which they've already indicated. This move also targets Russia, isolating it from Iran and also some elements of China's Belt and Road Initiative. This happened just days ago. Now, if we rewind a few months back, Trump bragged in front of Merz about taking out Nord Stream. This does not suggest that the US wants to make genuine peace with Russia. Temporary truce in order to make pivot to Asia makes sense from a Machiavellian sense, but from Russia's perspective, what will happen to them if US succeeds against China? Let's go to another element of this peace initiative, which seems to be very important. In fact, just several hours ago, President Trump has retweeted a letter from First Lady Melania Trump to President Putin, talking about the need to give children a pure future. Of course, this mirrors calls of many others to stop the war. President Trump has talked about this. Zelensky has also been pushing to stop the killing, although he calls it ceasefire as opposed to a peace agreement, which he doesn't want because that would entail addressing what Russia calls root causes. That premise has been largely accepted by President Trump during the meeting in Alaska. So it looks like Zelensky is not getting his time out without preconditions. Now, let's review this humanitarian motivation of President Trump. Specifically in light of this very humanitarian letter that First Lady Melania wrote, talking about the purity of childhood, the innocence of that period. It's, I think, impossible to disagree with that statement. However, is this consistent with President Trump's behavior? For example, he's acquiesced to Israel making Gaza incompatible with human life. Now, many people have argued that there was cause with Hamas. Yes, yes, yes. But does stop the killing not apply to over 2 million people who are struggling to survive in this devastated tiny strip of land? However terrible Hamas is. So this humanitarian seems to be selective, and one can therefore question it. Now, in the Ukrainian war, civilians are mostly evacuated. In fact, Putin recently has acknowledged that they still consider Ukrainians to be a fraternal people despite over 1 million military deaths. In Gaza, the situation is different. There are civilians that are perishing on a daily basis. And we haven't heard anything about that from either President Trump or Melania. So in summary, the weights I assign to Trump's so-called geopolitical wave function with respect to the composition of war versus peace towards Russia, I still hold to that assessment. Let me explain these slightly odd coefficients. They are an element of normalization, and they reflect 90% chance of war as an end state, the square root of 0.95, and roughly 10% chance of an end state of peace with Russia. Now, this is a relatively pessimistic projection, but I think it's consistent with Trump's 200 days in office during his second term, supporting Ukraine militarily, bombing Iran, and other evidence that I mentioned, eliminating Nord Stream or isolating Russia with the Armenia-Azerbaijan deal. So let's recap what has happened in Alaska. I think Trump is doing a masterful job playing everyone in a Machiavellian sense. Although I think this increases prospects of US isolation in medium to long term. But in the short term, his achievements have been remarkable. 3 weeks ago, Ursula von der Leyen offered hundreds of billions of euros to Trump for weapons, energy, and investments. Trump made this one-sided deal and turned around to essentially backstab the EU. And now they're all trying to fly over there to chaperone President Zelensky because they're concerned that peace may break out.
It's a hardball world, son. We've got to try to keep our heads until this peace craze blows over.
Consider the situation that would exist for the European Union if a peace arrangement went forward. The EU would presumably still be obligated to buy liquid natural gas from the United States at 3 to 4 times the price of pipeline gas from Russia. US would also presumably lift sanctions on Russia, resulting in an absurd situation where the European Union would be the only region in the world unable to buy Russian gas and opting instead to buy expensive US LNG. Now, this deal still needs to be ratified by the EU Parliament and may likely go to the US Supreme Court for the review stateside. But the US Parliament, I think, is perhaps even less likely to ratify that deal after this US-Russia rapprochement. So this beautiful deal may not stand. But on the surface, it's been very smooth. Getting EU investments and commitments pivoting to Russia and then to China. Now, of course, there are obvious problems of executing on this vision. The European Union will resist peace and resent being used. Russia has been fooled many times before and is unlikely to stop cooperating with China, while China has been preparing for a confrontation with the United States and is producing some 40 times more steel as well as ships compared to the United States. So this is my summary. Alaska meeting went well, and the results are very welcome. Trump acquiesced to Russian view, peace, long-term peace over ceasefire. Although he claimed that Moscow made concessions, but there's no evidence of that. None of this changes the expectations of what I call the empire's prospects in terms of the wave function and the weights for war and peace. Now, if Trump was serious about ending the US militarism, we would adjust these weights. But this would be noticeable elsewhere. He would be talking about renouncing US hegemony voluntarily rather than being done to us by force. He would be much more vocal about this change of strategy for end of the empire and the monopolar moment. This could wisely place US in a superior position for future development and secure a leading role in the family of nations, perhaps even the first among equals in certain sense, meaning the rules would be universal, but United States could outcompete the world in certain areas economically. It has the potential to be a significant dynamo of the world economics, as well as through positive actions that give it high moral ground. That would make it first among equals, that moral leadership. But it's the opposite of what we've been doing, which includes leveraging our veto power as a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Now, consider Ukraine. They would see this deal between US and Russia as a betrayal, and Zelensky is coming to protest. But many have argued that he surrendered the sovereignty long ago, unfortunately, so may not be in a position to influence diplomacy. Just like the South Vietnamese were not invited to the peace negotiations in France between the United States and North Vietnam and Viet Cong. Now, the real question is the response of the European Union to this potentially upcoming deal between Trump and Putin. They're certainly going to complain loudly, but will they ultimately accept Trump's logic about pivoting to China behind the scenes? This so-called division of labor, as has been stated by various think tanks, including the infamous Rand Institute, and recently also by the US Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth. Now, my understanding of the situation is that the European leaders cannot afford this pivot in terms of time. Their situation is extreme unpopularity. Friedrich Merz dropped in popularity at record speed and is now below 20%. Alternative for Deutschland is now the most popular party in all of Germany, not just the eastern half where its traditional power base is. One can, again, see similarities between the European Union and the Western Roman Empire after it started to weaken, and the eastern half had to support the Western half. Now, if Trump is serious about pivot to Russia, he will have a difficult time with Western media, which cannot pivot that quickly from Russia's evil shtick, which it has been pushing for years, starting from Russiagate under Hillary Clinton and other shenanigans. And also the EU leadership, where all the luminaries are coming to chaperone Zelensky tomorrow and to make sure that Trump does not pivot away from belligerence against Russia. The European leaders cannot survive the pivot to China and the US leaving the war in Ukraine long enough for this, to hold out for the United States for this pivot to work. Now, one has the sense that the European Union is reaching some kind of a boiling point and a possible Bastille moment. Hopefully nothing violent, but recently UK has once again had a petition for new election, which has gathered over 500,000, is now approaching 1 million signatures. Now, this reminds me of a poem and a book. Hopefully this will provide a little bit of a diversion and a memorable illustration of the points. First, the Robert Frost poem, Two roads diverged in a yellow wood.
I would like to start by reading a passage from Robert Frost. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood. And Homer.
All in favor of skipping the poem? Thank you.
And that has made all the difference.
One road is continuity of the US policies. We call this the empire. The other road is embracing multilateralism. Now, this switch of policies is extremely difficult. I'm going to cite an example of a business bankruptcy here, which has occurred quite recently in the United States, the Hooters restaurant. Here's some pictures of it. They were offering to supposedly sell certain types of fast food, but that wasn't the entirety of their offer. There were scantily clad waitresses. That part of the business model did not age well. So business is in bankruptcy, but some are still writing in late March about hopes to salvage this outdated business model. And that, I think, is comparable to Trump's pursuit of continuity of outdated empire. It's very hard to set aside a strategy, a business model that has worked for decades, sometimes for centuries in the case of Europe, with all of their various countries perhaps taking leadership roles at different times. But as I've mentioned recently in my Substack writing, some 500 years of reserve currency dominance by the European nations is likely coming to an end. So in case of United States, the different roads towards continuity of empire or the return to the republic is not just an update of strategy, of a business strategy as well, but a total repudiation of decades of policy, of the use of military force, political subversion, shenanigans in UN, tariff sanctions, leveraging the IMF, the dollar, and the SWIFT system to maintain hegemony. It would mean turning our back on decades of CIA operations, including those which killed JFK, defanging the military-industrial complex, which President Eisenhower warned about in his farewell address, et cetera, et cetera. Now, these two states, eigenstates, to use wave function terminology, empire and republic, are really mutually incompatible. This has manifested itself most visibly in terms of our foreign policy, but also has internal manifestations and implications. In other words, our behavior externally has reflections on our internal freedom. For example, the ability of citizens to speak up against COVID policy or certain policies for pushing the war in Ukraine or Gaza has been often curtailed. Some elite universities like Columbia and Harvard made to answer to the federal government directly about their policies. Here I come to the final reference, book The Stranger, written by Albert Camus during the Second World War II, in 1942, it was published. Now, this book is notable for its rather dire existentialist regard towards life, both of others as well as oneself. Now, at the end of this book, the protagonist and perpetrator of a murder caused by a minor slight is equally disinterested in his fate and essentially states that he hopes many people would come to witness his execution. The connection to what I'm talking about here is that Trump needs to make a similar spectacle of the switch from empire to the republic in terms of this sharp break from the empire that has existed for decades, supported by deep state media and perhaps even the national psyche, the mentality of exceptionalism. Now, President Trump is still the president, and this is essentially the euthanasia of empire, an assisted suicide or suicide. Now, I believe that for the republic to live, the empire must die. This, of course, sounds like a little bit of Harry Potter and Voldemort, but let's stick to The Stranger. Acceptance of multipolarity means effectively suicide of the empire. Now, the leader of the Western Empire must welcome this, remarkable change, effectively immolating himself like a phoenix in this fire. This is clearly a very dramatic thing to carry out, and human nature supports continuity of existing success, even if it's waning and the empire is running out of the road. Now, to summarize, Trump's peace overtures to Russia are welcome, but he must still get this priority past the Europeans and the deep state in order to pivot to China. However, there are indications that Trump is not really ready to bury the empire in favor of the republic. I don't see that much change in Trump's attitudes. He is simply recognizing the reality on the ground, military failure. The fact that Trump's administration is continuing imperial strategies elsewhere, including against Russia, confirms essentially the weights that I've assigned to the peace and war wave function versus Russia. Now, I still believe attempts to figure out the conflict in Ukraine are very, very important. I believe attempts to figure out Russia versus China as a priority for the empire will result in friction between US and various parties. Its allies, especially specifically in the European Union, and even with Russia in terms of execution. So we may see a forced collapse of the wave function to one of these states. And I think we all know what the more stable set of relations is, unfortunately. The alternative is for US to accept Russia and to stop trying to encircle it and break it up and admit that it has supported a proxy war against it. Now, if you like this content, please like, join, and subscribe.